Okay, so we're testing the createUser method in our user service implementation, and we have created mock objects on which this method depends, and we have stuffed them with sample values. Now we are ready to call the createUser method on the user service, and we already have user service auto-wired into our user service implementation class, and the mock objects should be injected into this user service object. So what I will do now, I will use user service and I will call a createUser method on it. And createUser method need to take in the user DTO object, user data transfer object, which we need to create. So we will create an instance of user data transfer object, equals new user DTO, and we will pass user data transfer object inside of the createUser, because if we look at the createUser method, it takes in one argument, which is user data transfer object, and then it uses this user data transfer object in the business logic. And I actually see that here in this block of code, it will use the user data transfer object to loop through addresses and set user details on the address, and also set the address ID for each address. And at this moment, we do not have list of addresses inside of our user DTO object. So let's update this user data transfer object stub and create a couple of addresses for it. So right here, I will create a new address object, address DTO equals new address DTO, like this. Let's import this address DTO, and now let's set a sample value. This will be an address of type, let's say this is shipping, like this. Now, because there can be a list of addresses, we will need to create a new array list. So we'll create a list of address DTO data types. I'll call it addresses equals new array list. And now I will add address to this list, like this. Let's import array list. Okay, so now when we have list of addresses, we can use user DTO and set addresses on this object, like this. And then we call the createUser. And now if I look at the createUser method one more time and I open its implementation, the end result of this method will be an object with the stored user details, which is user entity. Once the user details are saved, we will get back user entity, and then we will convert this user entity into a user data transfer object, and we will return this user data transfer object back. So if we want to check if this method was successfully performed and if this method contains expected value, we will need to also accept the return value here. So that's going to be user data transfer object, and I will call it stored user details equals, and the result of createUser method will be stored inside of the stored user details. So now when I have the stored user details, I can assert and check if the object is not null and if it contains values that I gave it to be stored. So I will use assertions, assert not null, and I will give it stored user details. So if stored user details is null, then method will fail. Now I can also assert that the created user details contains some values. Like for example, this object contains a first name, which is equal to the first name that I have requested it to store. So I will use assert equals, and the expected value will be taken from the user entity object, which I gave it to store, get first name, and the actual value will be taken from the stored user details, which was returned back to us, get first name, like this. So if the value of first name that I have requested this method to store does not equal to the value of first name which is being returned as a result of execution of createUser method, then I know something is not right. So let's save this, and I think we are ready to run this method and see if the bar is green. So I will bring up the menu, run as a JUnit test. And it fails. We have a null pointer exception, which means that something went wrong. Let's have a look at the null pointer exception, and it is inside of the verify email Amazon simple email service, line 66. So we're missing something. Let's go inside of the createUser method. Let's open its implementation, and here we have new Amazon simple email service, verify email. It takes in the return value. Let's go inside, and it also needs to have email verification token, which I think we don't have. So our verify email function takes in user DTO as an argument. Let's go to user service implementation and have a look at the verify method call. It takes in the return value, and return value comes from the stored user details. When we store user details in our database, we get back the entity object, which we then convert to a return value and send to a verify email. So this method save, when it's called, we return back stored user details. And because user repository is a mock object, as a result of save method, we are returning back a dummy object. So let's go back into our user service implementation test and have a look at the save method here. What it returns? It returns user entity. So let's go into user entity. We create it inside of the setup, and user entity doesn't have two very important values that Amazon simple email service implementation needs. It needs email verification token, and it needs user email address. So let's set them here. Our user entity stub was not complete. User entity set email, let's say test@test.com. So we have email address and we need email verification token. So user entity set email verification token to some value, which again doesn't really matter what it is. So I can type something like blah blah blah. Okay, so let's save this and let's try to run this code again and see if it passes or fails. Run as JUnit test. And here we go. We get a green bar, which means that all three tests have passed.